What's up, guys? John TheMorgile here, gonna do a yet another video about the moon and how the observations of the moon totally disagree with the heliocentric model. So, first of all, I want to give a big shout out and thanks to AJC 1844 and Anthony Riley, who introduced me to the channel. Now, before we get started, really quickly, I'm going to roll a clip that is a mainstream accepted version of the heliocentric model, just so that there's no silly arguments coming from the globetard community, because I am humoring the heliocentric model based on the assertions and the values of the heliocentric model. And what I've found here is a huge bombshell against the heliocentric model. But let's roll this quick clip just so that we're all on the same page in terms of what the globe heads are claiming is going on in terms of the orbit of the Earth around the Sun causing the seasons, and then we'll get into it a little bit deeper. But let's roll the clip first.
The axis of the Earth is an imaginary line on which the Earth rotates. It links up the two poles. Both the axis and the Earth are tilted at an angle of 23.5 degrees during a revolution. The tilting of the axis results in direct sunlight falling on different places during different seasons. This causes variations in the duration of days, nights, and seasons. Relationship between the location of the overhead sun and the seasons. Similarly, the revolution of the Earth and the tilting of the axis results in different angle of the sun during different periods. When the sun is directly overhead, we call this the overhead sun. At this time, the Earth's surface and the midday sun forms a 90-degree angle. Different locations of the overhead sun results in variations in the amount of solar radiation received in different areas and at different periods. Spring equinox, on the 21st or 22nd of March. The overhead sun is over the equator. The equator receives the largest amount of solar radiation. At this time, the northern hemisphere is in the spring equinox, while the southern hemisphere is in the autumn equinox. The angle of the sun decreases towards the poles. On this day, the two hemispheres receive a similar amount of solar radiation, and the length of day and night is the same at all places on the Earth. After this day, it is spring in the northern hemisphere, where the day is longer than the night. In the southern hemisphere, it becomes autumn, when the day is shorter than the night. Summer solstice. On the 21st or 22nd of June, the overhead sun is over the Tropic of Cancer. It receives the largest amount of solar radiation. At this time, the northern hemisphere is in the summer solstice, while the southern hemisphere is in the winter solstice. The angle of the sun decreases towards the poles. On this day, the length of daytime of the northern hemisphere is the longest in the year, while that of the southern hemisphere is the shortest in the year. Besides, there are 24 hours of daylight at the Arctic Circle and 24 hours of darkness at the Antarctic Circle. Autumn equinox. On the 22nd or 23rd of September, the overhead sun is over the equator again.
So, just to start off giving a little bit of background as to where we're going with this, it has to do with a little bit to do with orbital mechanics or orbital plane alignments. So we'll just start out, again, this is all humoring the heliocentric hypothesis for argument's sake. So we'll start out with the most basic premise that everyone is pretty much already aware of, but we have to start somewhere. So it's claimed that the Earth orbits the sun around a single plane, right, relative to the sun, and that plane is called the ecliptic plane. And the reason that we allegedly get our seasons on the spinning ball Earth is because our axis of rotation, or the axis which our ball is allegedly spinning around, is tilted from the ecliptic by a divergence of 66.6 degrees, or in other words, it's tilted from a line perpendicular to the ecliptic by 23.4 degrees. Same thing, just different ways of expressing it from different baselines. So, again, it is this, we'll just say, 66.6 degree tilt from the ecliptic, which allegedly causes the seasons, because that 66.6 degree tilt remains rigid in space as the Earth allegedly orbits the sun along the ecliptic plane. Right. So, with that being said, the equatorial plane is a little bit different. And oftentimes people confuse the equatorial plane with the ecliptic plane, but there is a big difference. Now, the equatorial plane, again, is not aligned to the ecliptic plane except twice a year, and that would be during the equinoxes, according to the heliocentric model. On the other hand, during both solstices, that 66.6 degree tilt of the Earth would be at its maximum divergence from the ecliptic in terms of the equatorial plane. So in other words, during the solstices, the equatorial plane would be at its maximum divergence from the ecliptic plane, and during the equinoxes, the equatorial plane would be aligned to the ecliptic plane. So with that being said, we can pretty much summarize that by saying that the ecliptic plane is constantly, slowly phasing from an alignment with the ecliptic plane during the equinoxes to a maximum misalignment to the ecliptic plane during the solstices, right? And again, that's what gives us our seasons. Now, because of this orbit of the Earth with its tilted axis to the ecliptic plane, apparently the sun appears to travel from the Tropic of Capricorn to the Tropic of Cancer and back over the course of a year. And again, when it's in the above the Tropic of Capricorn, that would be during the southern summer or during the orbital apogee. And on the other hand, the sun appears to be over the Tropic of Cancer during the northern summer, that would be during the alleged orbital perigee. And of course, during the equinoxes, the sun is apparently over the equator. So to put this in other terms, and just to keep this in the back of your mind before we get into the actual argument here, the equatorial plane is a variable plane depending on the season, according to the heliocentric model, while the ecliptic plane is a fixed plane relative to the sun, which the Earth allegedly orbits around. And again, that's how we get seasons, and that's how we allegedly get the equinox, which is when the sun is apparently above the equator, and the solstices during the northern summer, the sun is apparently above Cancer, and during the southern summer, the sun is apparently above Capricorn. And all of this has to do with the Earth behaving as sort of a gyroscope at a tilt, orbiting the Earth and maintaining its rigidity in space in terms of its axial alignment. This isn't getting into the precession of the equinoxes. That's a whole nother thing. But at least we have, we're all on the same page in terms of the heliocentric model, what causes the seasons, and the difference between the equatorial plane which is a variable, and the ecliptical plane, which is constant relative to the sun, and that ecliptic plane is the plane around which the Earth allegedly orbits the sun. Right. Now, in terms of the moon also apparently travels from Capricorn to Cancer and back over the course of a month. Now, they claim that the moon is orbiting the Earth at a 5-degree divergence from the ecliptic plane, not to be confused with the equatorial plane, but that's why they claim the moon appears to travel between the tropics, is because of this 5-degree divergence of its orbit from the ecliptic plane. Now, it really is quite rubbish, though, for if you model a two-scale Earth and Moon relationship, just in terms of the relative sizes and distances between the spherical Earth and spherical Moon, hypothetically, the 238,000 mile distance to the Moon will peak above or below the ecliptic entirely by thousands of miles, either north or south of the ecliptic plane, due to the Moon's supposed mere 5-degree orbital divergence from the ecliptic plane. What's even more interesting about this is that our axis is, our axis of rotation is, again, it's supposedly tilted from the ecliptic plane, or our alleged orbital plane around the sun, by 23.4 degrees from a line perpendicular to the ecliptic, meaning the moon should technically be orbiting the Earth at a 5-degree divergence from the equatorial plane in order to remain between the tropics at all times, even hypothetically. Now, this is very intuitive for an object that is supposedly governed by gravity, which somehow maintains a constant venture between the tropics. In other words, the heliocentric theory demands that the moon orbits the Earth in such a way that it remains in a constant flux between the two tropics, or in an alignment between the two tropics, depending on the time of the month, even though our axis is allegedly tilted 66.6 degrees from the ecliptic plane. Now, if the moon were merely orbiting the Earth at a 5-degree divergence from the ecliptic plane, certain times of the year it would apparently be altogether misaligned to the tropics by far, not even considering the distance involved in the 5-degree divergence, but because of this tilt of the Earth from the ecliptic and mere 5-degree divergence of the moon's alleged orbital path from the ecliptic. And so the moon at certain times of the year, like let's just say during the moon should be altogether misaligned with the tropics and the Earth entirely due to the tilt of the globe and the alleged distance to the moon. Now, if the moon were merely misaligned to the ecliptic plane by 5 degrees, it would sometimes appear far north or south of the tropics, way far. I'd really love to know how Globers explain how the moon knows to remain apparently between the tropics when it's supposedly 5 degrees misaligned to the ecliptic plane, while our axis is tilted at 66.6 degrees from the ecliptic plane. Again, the equator is only aligned to the ecliptic during the equinoxes, and the moon is not claimed to be orbiting along a 5-degree divergent plane from the equatorial plane, which is a constantly changing plane throughout the year. But instead, they claim a 5-degree divergence from the ecliptic plane. Again, when you extend a mere 5-degree divergence from the ecliptic plane alone, not considering the tilt of the Earth just yet, when you extend that 5-degree divergence out by 238,000 miles, just that alone would cause the moon to be far north or far south of the ecliptic plane, nowhere near the tropics at its extreme points of divergence. When you add the tilt of the Earth, the possibility of the moon in the heliocentric theory remaining between the tropics at all times is equally laughable and impossible. Now, heliocentric team should at least claim that the moon's alleged orbital plane is 5 degrees divergent from our equatorial plane, which might make these lunar observations slightly more feasible, but still impossible due to the distance involved. As you can see in this animation, the ecliptic plane is represented by the two blue dotted lines that go through the Earth. That represents the ecliptic plane. And the red line represents a 5-degree divergence from that ecliptic plane. And so when you extend a 5-degree divergence out by 238,000 miles, and by the way, this animation is roughly to scale, you can clearly see that the moon traveling that extreme distance from the Earth at a mere 5-degree divergence would place the moon roughly aligned to the ecliptic for, a good portion of the time. However, at its peak divergence from the ecliptic, it would be several thousand miles either north or south of the ecliptic plane. Certainly nowhere near either one of the tropics when it's thousands of miles south of the ecliptic plane. But of course, they don't claim that the moon is divergent from the equatorial plane. However, that still wouldn't make any sense in the heliocentric model, as again, the equatorial plane is constantly changing its angle to the ecliptic plane, and the equatorial plane only aligns to the ecliptic plane twice per year during the equinoxes. During the solstices, the equatorial plane would be at its maximum divergence from the ecliptic plane. However, the moon should maintain a mere 5-degree divergence from the ecliptic plane at all times, casting the idea of a moon that remains in between the tropics right out the window, especially during the solstices. Technically, we should see the moon apparently traveling well beyond the tropical areas according to the heliocentric model, even giving them the benefit of the doubt and assuming the moon can somehow manage to maintain a 5-degree offset to our variable equatorial plane, intuitively maintaining a perfectly consistent alignment with the tropical areas as the equatorial plane phases in and out of alignment with the ecliptic plane by 66.6 degrees maximum every 6 months during the solstices. Now again, the main crux of this argument is differentiating between the ecliptic plane and our apparent equatorial plane. The ecliptic plane would be constant relative to the sun, and the equatorial plane would be variable relative to the time of season. Now, it is claimed that the moon's orbital plane is consistently 5 degrees divergent from the ecliptic, meaning the possibility of the moon remaining in between the tropical areas all the time would be impossible. The only way that would be possible is if our equatorial plane was always aligned to the ecliptic and the moon was 5 degrees misaligned to the ecliptic. But that isn't the case. The equatorial plane is only aligned to the ecliptic during the equinoxes. And even assuming for argument's sake that somehow the equatorial plane was always aligned to the ecliptic plane, the mere 5-degree divergence of the orbital plane of the moon at 238,000 miles away would place the moon well above, north or south of the Earth itself, not just merely bouncing back and forth between the tropics. And so during the solstices, when you've got this, 23.4 degree tilt from a line perpendicular to the ecliptic plane, the moon would have no chance, even possible chance, to appear within the tropical areas. So this is just yet another piece of huge evidence against the heliocentric model, and I'd really love to hear how they argued their ways out of this one. I suppose a brief summary is in order, although I think I have covered the point fairly well. It makes perfect sense to me. Hopefully you guys understand it, because it is a little complex at first, but in summary, we have the ecliptic plane, which is allegedly the plane relative to the sun, a fixed plane relative to the sun that the Earth orbits around. However, of course, the Earth is allegedly tilted from the ecliptic plane by 66.6 degrees. And as the Earth goes around the sun, that angle, that 66.6 degree angle, remains rigid in space, sort of like a gyroscope would. So as the Earth allegedly orbits the sun, it's going to phase from a maximum misalignment of 66.6 degrees in terms of a misalignment between our equatorial plane and the ecliptic plane. And that would be during either solstice. However, the equatorial plane and ecliptic plane would be aligned during the equinoxes. And again, the moon is allegedly misaligned to the ecliptic plane by a mere 5 degrees and somehow manages to apparently travel from Capricorn to Cancer and back over the course of a month. Now, the reason that this is impossible, again, is because our Earth's equatorial plane is not aligned to the ecliptic plane except for twice a year. And so in order for the moon to even attempt to remain between the tropical areas, it must necessarily be 5 degrees misaligned to the equatorial plane, not the ecliptic plane. And what this would entail is the moon intuitively misaligning itself to the ecliptic plane to remain in alignment with our equatorial plane, more or less. And frankly, that's impossible, but even humoring that impossible theory, which they don't even claim, but even humoring that, that mere 5 degree divergence extended out 238,000 miles would place the moon thousands of miles either north or south of the ecliptic at its peak divergence. So hopefully that sums it up. If you don't understand it, let me know in the comments and I'll try to do a follow-up video on this. But this is a bombshell that I just sort of figured out early this morning. I was watching a video and I did mention the guy's name. I'll put a link to his channel here in a card and in the description as well, because he got me thinking about this. And something clicked where I realized that we've got yet another gaping hole in the heliocentric model. This truly is a bombshell, and I hopefully I was able to help you guys understand where I'm coming from. But again, let me know in the comments if this isn't making sense, and I'll try to do another video on it, because it is a little hard to explain, but once you get it, it makes perfect sense. And in terms of making perfect sense, it shows yet another big piece of evidence that the heliocentric model does not work. With that, I would really like to thank you guys for your time. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to me. I want to thank my patrons through Patreon, my subscribers, everybody that supported the channel and the book effort through PayPal. If you would like to become a patron and pledge as little as $1 single per month, which is about 3 cents per day, it would be greatly appreciated. Although it's not obligational, my content is always free. Of course, Patreon does take a while to process, and they take a cut. If you'd like to support the channel directly, you can do so much more easily to the direct link, www.paypal.me/TheMorgile1. Or you can contact me via email to jonelance@gmail.com. Really do want to thank you guys for your time. God bless you all. Spread the word, spread the world, and peace.